Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be back with you all again, and welcome to session 3 of our book study on how learning happens. Jim, go ahead.
Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Hewitt. I'm a professor of education at the University of Toronto, and I'm one of your co-presenters. And then my other co-presenter is Dr. Nidhi Sachdeva, who's also a professor at the University of Toronto. The two of us, we teach an awful lot together, often co-teach courses on the science of learning for both pre-service and graduate education. So we're both really happy to be here. Happy Saturday, everyone. And this is the book that we're studying. It's entitled How Learning Happens, Seminal Works in Educational Psychology and What They Mean in Practice. So this is an award-winning book written by Paul Kirschner and Carl Hendrick. And each of these chapters that we've been looking at examines a seminal article from educational research that's had important practical implications for instruction. So we think it's a really great resource for any teacher, and we use it as a textbook for all of our courses.
All right, so what have we done so far? In our first session, we talked about the information processing model and cognitive load theory. And in our second session, we explored the role of prior knowledge and advanced organizers a couple of weeks ago. And today we're going to be looking at depth of processing, deep processing. So our agenda for today is in front of you. We'll begin with a quick review of sessions 1 and 2, after which we'll be talking about depth of processing, as I mentioned. And we want to begin talking about this topic by exploring a theme about study strategies. So what kind of study strategies have been found to be effective and which ones are not so effective? There's a tremendous amount of research on this, so we're going to talk about that. And after that, we want to summarize some of the findings about long-term memory and semantic processing, which is the theme for today. We dig into our long-term memory to understand what depth of processing actually means and what leads to depth of processing. And then we'll have a breakout room activity in which we will talk about how educators can foster deep learning. So let's begin the session today. And I forgot to mention that before we do the quick review, we're going to do a really, really quick retrieval practice. And we briefly mentioned this last time when we were talking about prior knowledge, 2 things, and I shared an article by Dr. Pooja Agarwal as well. So we're going to do the 2 things with us all together right now. And it's pretty simple. Basically, what we want you to think and remember 2 things from the previous 2 sessions that perhaps resonate with you as an instructor, or you've done that in your class, or you applied that recently after attending this book study. Share those 2 things, just 2 things, with us in the chat. So we'll give everybody maybe 2-3 minutes. Take your time, think, remember, share, and see what really resonates with you about the first 2 sessions that we've done so far. And we can't wait to see what you type in the chat. Thank you for that one, Kate. The novices and experts. And you mentioned a very important point about discovery learning and guided instruction.
Yeah.
Chunk.
I like the one about the curse of knowledge too, because, instructors, because we know instructors tend to know a lot, and sometimes they assume students know things they don't. So, yeah.
Yeah. Importance of activating the knowledge. It was something really powerful. I think I read
Minimize
somewhere.
distractions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I must have mentioned about the extraneous load and sticking to the hooks of prior knowledge and going for those.
Mhm.
Fantastic.
And experts have these really elaborate schema already in place, which allows them to problem solve much easier. They can work forward from their knowledge of prior problems.
Right. Melissa has importance of students repeating their understanding of the learning, clarification, visualization to move information to long-term memory. So yeah, that's something of that sort we're going to also be talking about today, Melissa. That's great. Thank you. How easy it is to flood working memory. Yes, it's it's true. Especially the notion of expert blindness, right? It's like everybody knows it, we think sometimes, and it's easy to get into that trap. Impact of quick multiple choice quizzes, low stakes quizzes being a great way to activate prior knowledge at the beginning of a lesson.
Yeah,
Schemata of experts help them decode more information. Yes. Um, these are great.
these are really
Cursive
good. Yeah.
knowledge. Yeah. We think we know more than we actually know. Yes. That's great. Thank you. Oh, mnemonics to improve information retrieval. Thank you. Yeah, we're starting to get into the theme of what we're going to be discussing today. And if more thoughts come, you can keep adding. And thanks for all these really great thoughts. And I mentioned that last time that two things is such a it's a form of brain dump of retrieval practice if you think about it. But it's kind of focused on two things. So it's really reminding you, for example, as a participant, but you could do that as an educator in your class as well, online or in person, just focusing on the two things and really thinking about why these two things matter to me and then sharing those. And when you share that, what's really amazing is that I share two, Jim shares two, Anustab shares two, Melissa, Kate, we all share two. And then there's so much more public knowledge once again available for our review. And we're all reading it and thinking about it again. So I think very simple exercise can be easily done in like the beginning of a session for about 5 minutes. And I was mentioning last time is that it is shown to have more impact when it's done after a bit of a space learning. So like we did right now, not right away after the session, but we did it pretty much, for the first session, it was 4 weeks later, and the second session, it's about 2 weeks later. So thank you, folks. That was really good. All
Yeah, that
right.
was that was terrific. I was thinking like so Nidhi and I were talking about doing this just before the session, and I was thinking, oh, it's Saturday morning. Are people going to be able to rev up their brains?
Well,
Remember.
they well did. Look at that spaced repetition. Another one came. Prior knowledge improves reading comprehension when a student has poor fluency.
Yeah.
That was the baseball study. Yeah, exactly. So thank you, folks. Thumbs up to everyone. Awesome. Yeah, it is Saturday morning, isn't it? Okay, perfect. Jim, you take the word from here.
Sure, sure. Okay, I'll just do a quick overview of this, but so I'll just do a quick review of the first week. We began with the information processing model. This is the advanced organizer that we use really for this entire set of workshops, and it ties together all of the papers that we're going to be and all the chapters that we're going to be looking at in the book. And so in this model, we begin by receiving information through sensory memory, primarily visual and auditory information. But before it can be stored in long-term memory, it first must pass through working memory. Our working memory has a very limited capacity. We talked about it only having 4 to 7 chunks of information that we can hold in there at one time. This is the bottleneck. So in the first week, we talked an awful lot about this bottleneck and the limitations that it imposes on learning. And this is where we come up with the whole notion of cognitive load theory. Basically by understanding the limits of working memory in students, it gives us some ideas about how we can tailor instructions so that students can learn better. And it talks about all the different things that can cause problems with working memory, things like distractions in the classrooms or just not having adequate prior knowledge and long-term memory. All of that can increase working memory and cause problems for students. So therefore, from an educational perspective, one of the most important roles of the teacher is to ensure that students' working memories are not overloaded. And that's the fundamental idea behind cognitive load theory. It's all about taking care not to overwhelm a learner's working memory. Now, we've got
Oh,
our
sorry. I
animation.
guess we have the animation in there.
Right.
There's a
And
little show. Yeah.
yeah, so in the second session, we looked at the importance of prior knowledge in our long-term memory and this whole notion that knowledge builds on knowledge. So learning is all about connecting new knowledge to our existing knowledge in long-term memory. If students have the proper prior knowledge, then they're in a better position to learn. So this is a diagram that we showed you last time we met. And so we've got two learners here, student A and student B. Student B had prior knowledge that student A lacked. So when a lesson was taught, Student B was better able to create links and associate the new knowledge with prior knowledge. But student A doesn't have that prior knowledge, so the links can't be created. Student A might retain some of the information that was taught, but not as much as student B. So this is a real issue in classrooms. We have to be careful that, if we're teaching kids who don't have certain prior knowledge, maybe it's because of cultural reasons or because we haven't explained certain things. The students who have that prior knowledge are going to be at an advantage. We also have to make sure that the prior knowledge is activated. So we have to signal which prior knowledge is relevant and which prior knowledge students should hook new knowledge to. One of the classic studies that we talked about last week was the baseball study, in which students who had prior knowledge of baseball had a much easier time of understanding stories about baseball. So the big thing, I guess, that we take away from this research is that knowledge is important. It's not enough to be able to just look up things. With the baseball story, the students couldn't just go away and learn an awful lot about baseball. That was good. That doesn't help them at the time when they're reading the story about baseball. It's better, you need to know things in order to be able to build on things. So we need to take into account what children know and don't know. And if they have no experience or prior knowledge in a particular context, and the learning depends on that, then we have to help them and provide them with the knowledge they need to do the lesson. So the findings from this study are particularly important for second language students or students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or students from different cultures who may lack the vocabulary or the cultural references or certain types of world knowledge. So the next thing we want to do is talk about these connections in long-term memory. We've talked about the connections being important, but what kinds of connections do we want to establish? What does it mean to learn something in a deep way? How do we create really strong memory traces that persist in students' minds and aren't easily forgotten? And so that's the focus of this week's chapter, examining the best instructional strategies for ensuring that new knowledge is encoded in effective ways. So so how do we take these kind of red squares in working memory and create strong and lasting connections in long-term memory? This has been the topic of our chapter, How Deep is Your Processing? So just to start off this process, we thought we'd begin by talking a little bit about how each of us personally tries to get new knowledge into our own memories. So what do you do when you want to remember something? What do you do if you want to, like, for example, when you were in school, what did you do to study when you wanted to recall something for a test you were taking in a few days? Did you read notes? Did you practice certain exercises? Did you highlight passages of text? How did you go about it? And so we're kind of curious about what you did. Nidhi and I have kind of shared with each other the strategies we used as learners, but we'd love to hear some of your ideas. So we're going to use, we thought we'd use a tool called Mentimeter to collect some of these ideas and share them with one another. Nidhi, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to stop the slideshow for a second for that. And we're going to use Mentimeter. And Mentimeter is a tool that we could use for running some quick polls and surveys, and just everybody gets to collaborate. So what you want to do is, on top of my screen, you see a link called menti.com. So you could use your phone, or you could just use a different browser on the same computer that you're attending the presentation on, and just go to menti.com, and you'll type in the code that's on the top of the screen, which is, and I can type in the chat as well, which is 49904532. So I can see some students or some folks have already started to add some things. And as you pop in and press enter, things will start popping and it'll create a beautiful little word cloud for us. So going to menti.com, and typing in the chat, typing in the code 49904532. Take a moment, that's okay. I had some issues at my end anyway. So what you don't want to go to is mentimeter.com. The tool is called Mentimeter, but the link you want to go to is menti.com. That's the common error a lot of folks make. Okay, things are coming in, so awesome. Okay, great. A fun list of study strategies are coming in from the teachers. These are all teachers. Reading aloud, explain to a partner, repetition. And you'll notice that the words that tend to be a little bit bigger in size means that more folks have actually used the same word. So it kind of like uses that algorithm and just puts it up a little bit bigger. Sketchnoting, I'm not sure what that is.
That sounds cool.
Yeah. Oh, maybe like drawing a sketch of it.
Ah, with annotations, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably going to sound like a bit of a fixed mindset thing, but I've not been very, very effective with my drawing for the bigger part of my life. So I depend on my kids mostly. They're really good. Study groups, over highlighting. I wrote right there, study for several days, rewrite my notes. Still jumping around, it means folks are still adding in, which is great. And I know there's a lot of engagement in the chat. Jim and I will definitely take the time to go through those questions later on for sure. Okay, writing is quite popular because I see many flashcards. Organize, okay. Record and listen, interesting. Exit tickets. Take notes, writing down keywords. Somewhere I saw mnemonics, but it danced away. Oh, right here. Fantastic. Wow, this is a really decent sized cloud that we have here. Okay. Cornell notes, I like that. I really like the Cornell note taking technique as well. Rehearsing important fact, reorganize notes, conceptual maps, partner work, infographic. Wow, fantastic. You all must have been amazing students and did really well in school. I know overall educators. So look where it brought us. Awesome. Okay, so now I have another question. And in this one, you could actually vote. So you stay with the same Menti space for me. And at the bottom, you see there's the more common ones that tend to pop up when folks share their study strategies, students or educators, like what we did back in the day. So there's highlighting, underlining, review, rereading, teaching others, flashcards, mnemonics was there, summarizing, practice testing. So I've taken some of the more common ones and added in them there. So take your votes here and you can choose more than one, by the way, and just press enter and we'll see which ones end up showing to be more popular than others. And I can see about 8 or 9 folks have added so far. So we'll wait a little bit just to see how many more responses we get. Yeah, I kind of love this visual, especially because the word cloud is just lots of ideas in there. But this one, like, we're really picking and we can really see which one ends up being the more go-to strategy for a lot of us. Okay, maybe we'll wait a couple more seconds for a few more contributions. It's a pretty close call between the three, highlighting, rereading, and summarizing. Practice testing is quite up there with highlighting as well. Okay. Awesome. Any last minute votes? Okay, so we can move. Perfect. So thank you. Thank you. I'll take us back to the presentation now, actually. So what we just did was just to see what we actually do with the study strategies, or did with the study strategies, right? So these are ours, and you may have seen them with your students as well. So thank you for sharing those study strategies. I hope you enjoyed working with that environment and sharing that with us as well. So that was great to see. And now why we want to talk about is that because there's been a lot of research on study strategies, and I often find it a little bit interesting is that we in the cognitive science space know so much about it, but the focus almost always end up being the what of the curriculum, so what the students need to learn. And we don't often talk about the how. So we thought it would be nice for us as educators as well to share what the research actually says, right? And turns out that folks who have spent the time to study these study strategies have given us very clear answers that some strategies are more effective than others. And we want to share the results of this particular research area with you now. Okay, so there have been hundreds of experiments conducted on different study techniques. I think there were about 10 of those. Dunlosky and Daniel Willingham was part of that crew as well. Back in 2013, Dunlosky and colleagues did a review of this literature, and they identified 10 common techniques and then assessed the effectiveness of each technique based on the literature. So they actually looked at not one, not two, not several hundred, but 700 academic articles to put together a review and analysis of what are the study strategies research saying and which ones are actually effective, that is worth using them in your study time or integrating them as a part of your study, and which are absolutely not effective or largely ineffective. So let's see. So the 10 techniques that they chose were out because of popularity, because students were choosing them more. Through surveys, they understood that. Through research, they understood that. So the first 5 were highlighting. Needs no introduction. We know what highlighting is. It's beautiful. It's pretty. You can use pink. You can use orange. There's so many different ways to do that. Imagery for text. I think that was a bit of that notion of maybe sketch noting or creating a visual image of what you're learning. Practice testing, which is the word was used back in 2013 when the research was conducted. I do prefer to use the more open word now, which doesn't have the word testing in it, which is retrieval practice. So I said or, but that wasn't the word that was used in the 2013 article. Rereading was very popular, and summarization. So all of these you all have mentioned as well in your in the word cloud that we just generated. Let's look at the other 5. So the other 5 were elaborative interrogation. And basically, elaborative interrogation is this technique where, as a learner, you develop a tendency to ask the why and how questions, because they noticed that this was one of the techniques that was being used and was analyzed in many of the research papers out of the 700 papers. So this notion of asking questions about how does it relate to what I already know? Why is it like this? What else is there? So making those connections. Self-explanation, very similar. This idea of teaching to yourself, talking to yourself. And it's quite similar to teaching others as well. It's the idea of like explaining something in your own words, right? Mnemonics came in as well as a part of the 10 strategies. Distributed practice, another name for it is spaced learning, spaced practice, spaced repetition. So not doing it as a massed learning, but breaking it up. So kind of like what we did if you were studying for an exam, cramming the night before would be the exact opposite of distributed practice, but studying a little bit over time would be the distributed practice approach. And the last one they had in the list was interleaving. Interleaving is this idea, and I have a picture of a fruit salad if people are confused why fruit salad is because it's because I love fruit salad, and my kids were eating it upstairs with waffles, so it made sense. But it's also appropriate because it's kind of mix it up idea. But because I have this picture of fruit salads, it's that mix up similar categories. So I don't have broccoli in there, for example. So that's really the idea of interleaving, is that you mix topics within a bigger, wider subject to add the little challenge for your learning, but not mixed up to the point that those things actually don't align well. So that's why fruit salad, and there's no broccoli in there. Not that you can't eat broccoli and berries, absolutely, but I had to have some visual, and this is the one I went with. Okay, so let's see what they actually found in this particular research. The gold star winners were practice testing, aka retrieval practice, and distributed practice. by far, there was no confusion when they looked at those 700 articles and put together the review. Practice testing, again, quizzing yourself gets higher marks, kind of this idea, is something that really was proven to be an effective study strategy. It showed that when you did that, when students did that, when learners did that, it helped them retain information better. And distributed practice was also seen to be a very, very big winner, because when you space your studying, then you're adding that little component of that challenge. But the more sort of that gap you add, the more work your long-term memory is having to do, but then it ends up retaining it better. I am going over this idea in a slight bit of a fast way, you'll notice, because the good news is our next session is actually dedicated to retrieval practice, distributed practice, and interleaving. So we're going to be doing a lot more detail about that, but just so you know that these were the winners, gold star winners. The runners up were elaborative interrogation. So this idea of channel your inner 4-year-old. How would you explain it to a 4-year-old kind of idea? They did really well as well. Self-explanation, explain it to yourself and make connections. And interleaving also was a very, very up there strategy. And if you notice that all these kind of require this idea that when you've learned something and you're using these strategies, be it practice testing or elaborative interrogation or self-explanation, you're thinking about the content, you're paying attention to it, and you're producing it either in the form of the practice test or you're explaining it, you're asking. So there is that deeper component. So which is why we decided to discuss these study strategies, because they do lead to that notion of deep processing that we're going to be exploring, or we are exploring this week. Right? Okay, the strategies that were largely ineffective were highlighting and rereading. And this makes a lot of sense. They're very popular. So people do tend to do that, these two things. And if you notice that we had the word repetition and rereading also quite big there. We had those highlighting, rereading in the bar graph as well, quite high up there, along with practice testing and other summarization as well. So they're popular, that makes sense. But they were ineffective because research shows that they actually don't lead to long-term learning. They don't lead to deep processing, because they don't really give you the enough reason, or a learner enough reason, to engage with the topic. You're so focused on coloring, you're focused on rereading. And the aspect that's important to think about highlighting and rereading is that it's not just to say that they're ineffective, but they're actually dangerous if you think about it, if your students are doing it or if your children are doing it, because they give a perfect illusion of learning. Everybody feels that they're learning, but they're actually not learning anything from it. Because when you and I often say in all my presentations, like, what was the last thing you highlighted? And people can't really remember that, because it's not that deep connection was established when you're doing that. Same goes with rereading. When you're reading it, it makes you feel that you're pulling it out of your memory, but you're not, because it's right in front of you, right? So they were largely ineffective. So they don't work. But they're fun to do, I almost feel, which is why I think we need to remember that because they're ineffective, this conversation needs to be more explicit with our learners as well. The other three that came out as kind of in between, we don't know much about it. So as it says, unclear, depends, and more evidence is needed. The three were imagery for text, summarization, and mnemonics. So the Donlosky article says that imagery for text learning needs more evidence before it can be recommended. This technique involves having the learner create an image for each paragraph they read. The results on this have been inconsistent. The research on summarization is unclear as well, in part because it is often implemented in different ways. Everybody does summarization slightly differently. If students write summaries without referring to any resources or sources, then it's probably useful, right? So they did it from their memory. However, if students write summaries with the material on the table in front of them, then it's probably less useful, right? It's more of a copy-paste approach, because then they can get into a habit of writing the summary just by, again, copying and not thinking too deeply about it, right? Mnemonics have also had mixed success. They may be beneficial for certain kinds of knowledge, like needing to remember the order of the planets in the solar system, but sometimes they don't help. And one of the things to remember is that sometimes what happens is it's the mnemonic that students remember, but not what they actually mean. The content gets missed out. So the mnemonic kind of like takes over because they're so fun and too exciting. So using them cautiously is important. So mnemonics doesn't become the content to be remembered, but mnemonics is a medium to actually what you need to remember. And that's probably why there's some mixed reviews in there and mixed success for mnemonics. Okay. So those were the results. Jim, you take the word from here.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so it was really very interesting to find that some of these strategies were more effective than others. So this review by Dunlosky was really quite stunning because it's got like 800 studies all kind of brought together. And it's quite powerful to see which strategies are winners and which are less effective. One of our concerns, of course, is that a lot of students study by just rereading their notes or rereading things or even highlighting, and these turned out to be the least effective strategies. So it's really something to think about. We were having this kind of nice in the chat. We were talking about this, and one person was saying, "I really wish I knew this in school," you know, and I was just realizing that I think I went through all of school and nobody ever talked to me about study strategies, right? I'm just kind of left on my own to figure it out for myself. So, but I imagine that if we can start talking to kids about study strategies and what works and what doesn't, it could really empower them and help them in all the subjects they teach.
Yeah, I just want to mention one small thing, Jim, before you move on to the next one, is that I've talked about this research multiple times with teachers, with principals, with students, and it's almost always the kind of word cloud that we generated. And it's because that's what we've always depended on. And this is this notion of learning can be quite counterintuitive at times, right? That whole notion of highlighting and rereading, it's what everybody does. It's what my kids would do if I didn't tell them that this is actually not working for you. Because after a little break, if I say, well, what do you remember? It's like, oh, I don't really remember anything, right? But I will tell them that highlighting, so we will not buy highlighter to highlight content, we'll buy highlighter to do other art projects, for example. But I've done this with teachers, students, educators, and it's almost always I've seen a similar result. And I have been in that situation myself as well. And again, going back to Jim's point, is that I think an explicit discussion about what actually works, what doesn't work, should be a part of our instructional practice as well, in addition to the content, I would say. So just wanted to mention there.
Right. Hey, Nidhi, I think Paul's here.
Oh, okay. So should we stop sharing and just
Yeah, let's introduce Paul.
all right. Surprise, surprise. Paul Kirschner is here, everyone. So Paul, we were just talking about study strategies and we're about to get into the theme of deep processing. But I think everybody will remember this session now. It has already been deeply processed in everybody's brain because you're here. So take the word if you want to say a few
I have
things.
nothing. I'm more here to see if anybody has any questions for me. And if the answer is no, then I'll just stop and go somewhere else and do some other things. It's the end of the afternoon. So it's more like, okay, I'm making a surprise visit with zero planning. I have no presentation, nothing ready. But I thought, if there are some people there who say, like now that Paul's online, I've always wanted to ask him this, that, or the other thing. Now's their chance to ask him this, that, or the other thing. So I see you have a nice group.
We do, and it's
Yeah,
been going really great. Yes.
Including me, 31 participants. So I'd more say from what have you been talking about, and does anybody have any questions or whatever? And I'm more than willing to try to give an answer to it. And at a certain time, we'll go downstairs and put on the wood burning stove and pretend it's almost spring.
I think people are just flabbergasted. They're just like, "What? Paul's here?"
Yeah,
I
Paul's
think
here.
all the messages in the chat are just like, "How great! Paul's here. Welcome, Paul. Thank you for joining. Amazing. Wow. Nice surprise." That's all I'm seeing. Yeah. Anna Marie is asking, "Where are you, Paul?"
Excuse me, where am I? I'm in the south of the Netherlands at the moment. That's where I live. It's almost in Germany. If I get in the car and I drive for 10 minutes, I'm in Germany. If I get in the car and I drive 20 minutes, I'm in Belgium. I'm in this kind of like peninsula that juts down between Belgium and Germany. And at certain points in time, we're parts of sometimes both of them. So close to Brunsum, yes, close to Brunsum. Brunsum is one town further. I'm in the town of Hoensbroek. The next town is Brunsum. Yeah, whoever that was who wanted to know that.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, and Brunson was the answer by the same person who asked the question. And you do know, Paul, if we drive for multiple days in Ontario, we'll still be in Ontario.
Yeah, I know. And if I drive for 5 hours, I can go from the Netherlands to Belgium to Luxembourg to France to Belgium to the Netherlands
Oh,
in
wow.
like 4 hours.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. So let me read the
Okay.
question to you. So the first question is from Paul, and it says, are deep processing and understanding the same thing? Do they both help build long-term memory?
Now you could say that uh, deep processing leads to understanding. They're not the same thing. Understanding is the result. Deep processing, as it says, is the process. So what you try to do is you try to initiate study strategies, learning processes, as Ernie Rothkopf would call it, mathemogenic activities, which stimulate people to deeply process the information in different ways. And one of the results of the deep processing could be understanding. So they're related to each other, but they're definitely not the same.
Great, thank you. Christina is asking, what's the next focus for your learning research?
Now, research that I'm doing at the moment deals with things like interleaving, deals with how do you get teachers to, number one, understand in a declarative way what different study strategies are. Yeah, so to understand them. Number two, how do you get them to then make use of it? And that's by we're setting up a TPD in which the strategies will not only be taught in a declarative way and shown how it works, but also will be specifically embedded into the TPD so that the teachers experience what it is to embed the study strategy into their teaching. Because that's something that most teachers or many teachers don't do. They tell students what and why and how, but it still remains kind of abstract because they haven't embedded it. You know, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. So we're doing research on that. We're doing research on a number of multimedia principles, primarily the queuing principle. And at the moment, I'm writing a book with 3 other people. It's more a pamphlet on the paradoxes of teaching and learning.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was great. And we were kind of just discussing this idea that there's so much focus on the content in the curriculum, but not this declarative knowledge of how teaching or study strategies should be implemented and what they are, first of all. So that was really aligned. Thank you. Great question and great answer. Anustup is asking, what has been the most important addition to the science and learning literature in the last 5 years? What would you say that would be?
5 years. You're talking to someone who's 72. He thinks more in terms of 50 years.
You can go with that.
In the past 5 years. Well, you might say the fact that we've come to realize that cognitive load theory goes further than what people thought, that you can make use of it for things like creativity and deeper learning, and that people have kind of like come to understand that. There's been more and more research on that. I think if you look at Greg Ashman's Filling the Pail, he has Curiosas of the Week. I'd say to everyone, go and follow Greg. And
Yes.
unfortunately, he's now behind the paywall. But in this last Curiosa, which was published last night, in an event in Dutch time, he was talking about a really nice review study about cognitive load theory and creativity. So you can say, like people are kind of like no longer having this knee-jerk reflex of what cognitive load theory actually is, and they're beginning to understand that it's more than just learning facts, and that your working memory is so full of facts that you can't process any new facts. It's also that you can make use of it in a proper way to learn to become creative. And as hopefully, we all know, creativity requires knowledge. If you look at all, of course, that must be between air quotes, when I say all, of the great painters, even the most abstract, impressionistic painters, you see that they all began by painting within the lines and learning how to do it in the proper way before they became creative and started painting outside of the lines. I have a really I have a really nice slide that people can win copies of my book when I present it, because I asked them, who was this landscape artist? And it ends up being Vincent van Gogh or Piet Mondriaan. And people know Piet Mondriaan only from his lines and his red, white, black, and yellow spaces on a painting, like Victory Boogie Woogie. And you see that he really started painting still lifes and landscapes, and got that down, and then branched out. So this idea of that all of this kills creativity, it actually allows you to be more creative, because it teaches you the fundamentals. It teaches you the rules so that you can then better break the rules. Yeah. And I use a thing like, I used to learn, I can't paint, so I learned to paint by numbers, and even with respect to oil paints, paint by numbers. And so I always use, you have to learn to paint within the lines before you can learn or discover how to paint outside of the lines. So those are the types of things where in the last 5 years that I'd say people are finally beginning to understand.
Thank you. That was great. And thanks for mentioning Greg's work. I'm a really big fan of Greg's work as well. And Anushtub, thank you for sharing those links in there. Yeah, highly recommended work. And Greg's an excellent writer. And I almost feel sometimes I don't have a chance to meet with John Sweller, but it's like knowing Greg, he's probably the best knowledgeable person of cognitive load theory and instructional design that you could probably find. I haven't found anyone else other than,
you missed
other
someone that was
friends.
Jeroen van Merienboer, my colleague and partner in crime, who unfortunately passed away.
Yes.
But he was the person who was kind of like fundamentally responsible for spreading the idea of cognitive load theory outside of Australia, because you had Paul Ayres and Paul Chandler. I once wrote an article with Paul Ayres and Paul Chandler, and we had Paul Kirschner, and we had the title of the article was, you have to look it up, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Okay? I was the good, Paul Ayres was the bad, and Paul Chandler was the ugly.
Oh, that's funny. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
We have another question from Matthias, and it says, is there some way to make an effective study technique more effective, like a deeper way of summarizing, for example?
Yes. I mean, summarizing is summarizing. You're asking someone to paraphrase it. The first way is to make sure that they can't copy it, because what we often see by summarizing is that they will copy down and they'll leave out some words or some sentences. Okay, and then you're processing it to a certain extent because you've chosen what's important and what's not important. The next step is to do it in your own words. Close the book and do it in your own words. So you have to recall it. The next way to do it is not only to summarize, but to elaborate on it. So to think about it, yeah, to actively think about it. So not only what did Paul Kirschner say, but what might be something you can do with what he said. At that point in time, you have to think about it. So anything that you can do, that you can add to any technique, and that's also highlighting and things like that. Highlighting is bad because people often stop when they highlight and they think, okay, I've learned it. And I always say, I don't know of any neural connection between the end of a highlighter and your brain. Yeah. So it just doesn't go directly into your brain. Yeah. But if you do that, and if you as a teacher then walk through the student with the students, well, why did you choose to highlight this and not that? Is this the right thing? Is this the most important? If I would have highlighted it, I would have done this and this piece of modeling behavior on it. You've then made the highlighting more effective. If the next step that you do is, okay, now let's just take down the highlighted words and try to reconstruct the text from the highlighted words and not just look at that piece of paper that now looks like a rainbow. Yeah, you've made them think about it even more. So even the worst things that you can do, the things that have been shown not to work, can work if you do it in a certain way. If you reread something, but the second time you read it, you reread it, you then elaborate on it and think about why it's the case, instead of just reading it a second time, it becomes much more effective. So although you'll often hear me saying this and that and the other doesn't work, in its purest form, it doesn't work, but you can always make it work by embellishing it in a certain way. And that's what you maybe need to do with people, and that's not to try to wean them from doing what they're doing wrong, but have them try to use it in a way that they're doing it right. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and that makes it then easier. And then you can make the step to, now, do you really now need to highlight it? Couldn't you do it in another way that's possibly more actively processing the information? And so it kind of makes it a lot more a lot easier to lose the habit. Because that's the thing we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who already have a certain way of doing it, a habit. And I mean, you know yourself, if you really want to lose weight, the best way is not to stock your freezer with Haagen-Dazs caramel sea salt
Ooh.
ice cream, but not have it in your freezer at all. Yeah, but that's kind of like hard. So it's kind of like, okay, put some broccoli in it, type of thing. Please don't do that, but you understand the metaphor that I'm using.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. I think we have one more question that we'll have time for, and then
Okay, and then I'm gonna go
no problem.
downstairs.
I just want to say that I think you up the energy was good, but you've just upped. I just feel, Jim, is it just me, or just feels like the room is just so much more, there's like fresh live energy.
No, well,
It's
I saw
awesome.
that it was I saw that it was today, and I thought, okay,
Thank
who knows? I have
you.
other things to do. I was just on my fitness bicycle because I have to keep my lungs working well. So I was just on it, and I saw it. It came up from, it's now time. So I figured, okay, half
Oh,
an
you
hour
made
biking.
us.
Now 20 minutes, a half an hour of Nidhi and Jim.
Oh, thank you, and everyone else. You made us so
Everyone
happy.
else. Yeah, I don't know
I'll
the
take
other
one.
people. I only know the two of you.
Oh, I'll take one more question. Can you talk about what happens in the processing between working memory and long-term memory? I think that's an interesting
Yeah,
question. I wanted to take that.
I have the habit of saying, oh, but that's so simple. But it isn't hard. It's not rocket science. And although it's in your head, it's really not brain surgery. What happens is in your working memory, you're processing it. You're doing something with it. That processing can be as simple as repeating it. It could be thinking about it. It could be making connections. And when you're making connections, you're making connections to something. It could be making connections to something within the message itself, but it's often making connections to things in your long-term memory. So what you're constantly doing is you're hanging things up in your long-term memory so that the schemata in your long-term memory are getting broader and deeper and richer, that you're now, as Jean Piaget said, you're assimilating things into your cognitive schemata and accommodating the schemata to the new information. But what you're also doing, and that comes from David Ausubel, is you're subsuming things. So you're learning things, and all of a sudden, from all of these animals that go woof woof and that all have a name, you have a category of dog, and those are subsumed in. So you're creating sub schemata and super schemata in your long-term memory, and you do that by processing it in your working memory and then finding the place. It's not for nothing that David Ausubel said the most important thing for learning new things is what you already know. What you're doing is you're subsuming it, you're assimilating it into your long-term memory. And by doing that back and forth, you're strengthening the memory store, the memory trace, and the retrieval trace. The more different ways that you assimilate it into your long-term memory, the stronger the storage strength, the more and the different ways that you recall it from your long-term memory to make use of it again in your working memory, the stronger the retrieval strength, and the more quickly and effectively and efficiently and without mistakes it's retrieved. So it's that constant back and forth between processing and storing and processing and storing, and now I should say processing, storing, retrieval, processing, storing, retrieval. See it in that, and the storage and the retrieval are in your long-term memory, and the processing is in your working. So you put it in, you do something with it, you retrieve it into your working memory, you do something with it. Hey, it's been enriched. It goes back into your long-term memory. Hey, I need it for something. I pull it back out, and you increase the storage and the retrieval strength. You make it stronger, you make it faster, you make it more accurate. And that's the whole idea. And the more you do that, the less you'll forget. And people often forget that the opposite of learning is not forgetting. So what you're actually trying to do when you're teaching is teach it in a way that your students won't forget it. But they won't forget the information, not the semantic and not the episodic. I don't know if you know Mr. Barton's maths, and I think he talked about setting up something with his students and cutting jelly rolls into 7 parts. You should just look up jelly rolls and 7 parts. And the thing about that, and we wrote about it in our book, is that he then talked to a student a couple of years after that, and they remembered everything about the episode, but absolutely nothing about the math.
Yeah.
So it's the most important thing is that it needs to be salient, but not the episode, the semantic, the understanding. That's what needs to be made salient and retrievable, and not, oh, wasn't that a fun lesson? Because all you'll remember is the fun part and not the mathematics in it. And that's the whole idea, is you don't forget the math. Yeah? It's not important that you remember the episode, except when you're talking about what a great teacher Paul was. and things like that, then you want to remember the episode. But I prefer that you remember the semantics.
Yeah, thank you. I do
Okay.
want to
Yeah.
say that the notion, the information is really working in there. So it's a very appropriate word for the memory called working memory. The other thing I want to mention is that I do also genuinely hope that people don't just remember the episodic part of it, that Paul Kirschner showed up in session 3 of this book study, but what you said. And I think I was trying to type it up as you were saying it as well, and folks were reiterating as well. So that was amazing. So hope we'll
My
all
pleasure.
remember the
I'm
semantic
sorry
part of it.
I put you on a completely different line. I won't come in next week, but maybe in one of the last there are 3 more. It's in my Outlook, so you might get a surprise visit from me in one or more of the next 6 weeks.
Oh, we would
Okay?
love that. Thank you, Paul. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank
Take
you.
Thanks.
care. You're
You,
doing
you go
great
to your
work,
bike
Nidhi.
and
You too,
I'll
Jim.
be in touch. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
So this
Bye.
was of course, the chapter. Now, Paul's actually done a better job than we could have of describing a lot of this. But we'll go to the next page. On the next one. Next one. Next.
This one. No,
Yeah, go
you look
next.
further.
Next.
Oh, these ones.
These ones, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Okay, so one of the really brilliant things about this particular chapter and the wonderful work that Greg and Lockhart did and that Paul talks about in chapter 3 are some of the different ways that teachers can foster deep learning. So some of it is some of it involves elaborative encoding, in which, as Paul was talking about, getting students to elaborate on an idea. All of these are just different techniques of getting students to engage with the material and think about them, do more than just the kind of recognition layer that they do when they're rereading things, but actually to engage with it, making it distinct. Like, how does this new idea, what distinguishes it from something else? Having them create it, link it to their prior knowledge. We've talked about that before. How might we apply this new knowledge in a different situation? Can you imagine reworking this idea in a different way? Making it personal. How might you personally use this new knowledge in your own life? And transfer appropriate processing. How might you use this in a completely different situation? So there are a variety of different ways to foster deep learning in our teaching, and the Craig and Lockhart talk about some different ways to do that. And these are ways that will cause students to strengthen the memory traces that Paul was talking about, and make it less likely that material will be forgotten over time, because it will have these additional connections to the student's existing and prior knowledge.
Just want to add a couple of thoughts in there, is that things like giving examples or using stories or metaphors. Paul was doing a lot of that. All of that actually was helping us understand what he was saying. So it is going to help us foster deep learning. Why? Because it was giving us all an opportunity to make meaning. That semantic processing requires us to have meaningful connections to what we already know, to what is coming into our brain as we are, getting that through our sensory channels. So just some of these concrete examples kind of really nicely fall into these categories. And sometimes they bleed into each other as well, because you could use an explanation and example at the same time as well. So, and then you could apply that in a different situation. You can make it personal by creating a story about your own self or something that you did in the past. So, yeah. Jim, you want to talk about this slide?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. So
Yeah.
it's about getting kids to engage in and making these semantic linkages, as Paul was talking about,
Yes.
making meaning of it. Humans are really thirsty for meaning, and that's why stories are so wonderful, right? And as Nidhi was saying, creating meaningful linkages between new knowledge and what they already know. These are powerful types of links that really reinforce new understandings.
Yeah, I just want to mention this word here that says constantly pushing students to make meaningful semantic linkages. And that's really where the implication for instructional practice comes, right? Because that's what we want to be doing. And is it going to lead to what Paul was talking about, the episodic processing, or is it going to lead to the meaning making processing, which is more semantic kind, which they will remember much better, but not just the episode. I'll really briefly talk about this really powerful quote that Daniel Willingham has said, which is memory is the residue of thought, which basically means, and Paul actually touched upon all of this in his short little description. It was not short, but it was awesome. Students remember what they think about, right? So this is something that we as educators can do. So when picking classroom activities, it's important to pay attention to what the students will actually be thinking about it while doing this activity. So if you're getting them to make cookies because you're teaching them something about the cookies, what are they going to actually remember? But was it a historical reason around doing that activity, for example, right? So will this activity promote deep knowledge where the student will be forced to build deep connections between different parts of knowledge? So Willingham reminds us that you want to anticipate what your lesson will lead students to think about. You want to design your reading assignments that require students to actively process the text. You want to design your lesson so that students just can't avoid thinking about the lesson's goal. So it's always in their face. That's what's the goal and not just the activity that they're doing. Because the activity will be fun, but what's the semantics of it? Designing tests, for example, that lead students to think about and integrate the most important material. So whatever we do as instructors, our goal should be that we are supporting or pushing for that semantic processing to take place, because as Jim was saying, humans are thirsty for meaning. If we give the learners the meaning, then it's highly likely that it is going to deeply processed in the long-term memory, and that just means that it's available for them to use it again when they need to establish those connections. So you just have more prior knowledge, and then you just can learn more, basically, right? And that's that. We'll see if there's any questions and comments in the moment. I will just share. Yes, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, we'll stay online afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. We had some more time, but I just wanted to mention that our next session is this. I briefly mentioned earlier when I was talking about the study strategies, is we're going to deeply engage with the notion of retrieval practice, spacing, and iterative leaving. Note that this is not necessarily from the book, but we added into our book study because we just think that it is such an important part. It's actually in their second book in a different capacity, in the book called How Teaching Happens. And we really think that there's a lot of meat in this topic that directly applies into the instructional practice component. That's why talking about this is so important. So we have some readings there for you. We have a little micro lesson called What's So Good About Low Stakes Quizzes and how to leverage space practice and retrieval practice. It is the most powerful learning strategy you're not using. It's a great little article with an accompanying audio interview with Dr. Pooja Agarwal. So we're going to be doing that next week. But other than that, have a great weekend. I'll stop sharing the screen, but we'll stick around for a bit. And if there's questions, would welcome, or any comments or any amazingness that wants to come out of your, systems right now, because Paul was here. So, yeah.
Thanks, Nidhi. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Okay, we'll share also the Donlowski article, and for those who want to see it.
Yes, and I have a micro lesson associated with it. If you wanted to do a little retrieval practice about the Donlowski article and check your knowledge, you could do that as well. Alexandria is asking, will the recording be available later for later viewing? Yes, absolutely. And MJ usually either sends an email, and it's also shared on some social channels as well. Yes, Paul was a fabulous surprise, wasn't it? Yes. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for all the great comments that are coming in. And again, if there's any other specific questions, we're happy to stick around for a little bit longer. But if not, it was really fun.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Sorry, I just have a quick question. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand, so I'm just going to interrupt if that's okay.
Of course.
It's a question around mathematics, and my question is, with limited PD right now in Ontario, opportunity and funding and supply teacher shortage, as far as providing PD to teachers and supporting them with like concepts in mathematics, and then cognitive load theory and how to teach, and how do you get a balance between those two? Do they come in tandem? Is there one that's more important than the other? It's just really tricky in deciding where to put my focus on as a math consultant. And I just was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Can you clarify what are what are the trade-offs, or sorry, what are the two things? Cognitive load theory is like one thing that could be the subject of a PD session versus.
So learn supporting teachers in how students learn, and or supporting teachers in best practices around teaching mathematics, whether it be manipulatives, organizers, like all of those other little pieces in their actual application of the teaching, like of mathematics. Like it just seems like there's not enough time, and how do we get the balance between those two pieces, especially with new teachers, or when you're beginning a new program, or like we're shifting away from discovery learning and more explicit instruction, right? And it just seems like there's this tension. It's a struggle.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, at OISE, I teach, or Nidhi and I teach the kind of the human development course, and so we do an awful lot of science of learning in the psychology course, and then we have a math methods course that will do a lot with manipulatives and other things. Of course, you kind of want to link them too. Yeah, so PD is very difficult because, as you say, there are so many contrasting, competing priorities, and there are also a lot of things out there, building thinking classrooms, for example, that are very popular right now, but they don't really have an evidence base. But nevertheless, school boards, want to teach about those things. So yeah, I don't really have a good answer to your question.
If I may, Carrie, and I totally understand the struggle and the tension that you're experiencing as an educator and as a consultant as well. The one thought that I will share with you is, personally, when I started, things started making sense to me about science of learning, and when I started engaging more with this theme a certain number of years, then everything else that needs to be done in the classroom made a lot more sense to me. So what I'm saying is that thinking of science of learning as a little bit more of the overview approach, and then when you talk about math in there or how to teach languages, then it just makes a little bit more sense. So I'd say this is important stuff, and as you do more of this, the other part of like specific subject specific stuff will probably happen faster, I'm hoping, and it will make a lot more sense. And again, I don't know really the answer, and I truly do respect and acknowledge the struggle that you're feeling, but it's just yeah, that's just the thought that I have.
Yeah. And one of the nice things about what you're suggesting, Nidhi, is that, like, if you understand cognitive load theory, then it kind of makes sense why manipulatives might be good initially for novices, but then once they develop some expertise, that manipulatives get in the way, right?
Or for example, it makes sense to me now that cognitive load theory and prior knowledge and complex reasoning requires lots of prior knowledge. So it's good to know your math facts, because then you're not overloading your working memory. So point being, because I know that now, it makes more sense for me to apply that when my kids are, for example, learning math. So that's exactly. Thanks for clarifying that, Jim. Yeah, probably not an answer, Carrie, but maybe something. Anyways, are there any other thoughts or questions? I know there was some lovely comments, and I said thank you. Thank you so much. And Matthias is definitely mentioning some really interesting stuff in there, so I highly recommend. I also highly recommend following some of the work that Matthias does on Twitter and LinkedIn, and shares some open, great Google Docs content about analysis of the two books that Paul has written along with Carl, and also the second book, How Teaching Happens, and also some of Barbara Oakley's work that he's connected it. So fantastic stuff there. Thank you. Catherine, yes, go ahead. And then we'll call it a day after that, promise.
So I work in the special education field a lot, and I'm wondering, what would your advice be to educational assistants to best support their charges learning? I mean, I have my preconceived ideas. But I'm just wondering that from your lenses, I'd love to hear from each of you. What would you feel would be the biggest takeaways for this about how they can help support the learning happens when we're looking at a child that has poor working memory and is easily just overloaded from what's happening within the classroom?
You want to go first, Nidhi, or do you want me?
Sure. I mean, the research I've read so far, and I'm continuing to explore now, is having this conversation with Anna Stocky also, who's a professor of math, is that, explicit instruction, all the strategies that we're talking about benefit a lot. So removing all the extraneous, removing all the scaffold, always review, and we're trying to lead by example here as well. We started this session, for example, with a recap, because some of the folks may or may not have done session 1 and session 2. So direct instruction, following the principles of instruction that Barack Rosenchen, we're going to be covering that in the book study as well. That has shown to benefit folks, especially where there's different kind of learning challenges that we're experiencing. And when we do that, everyone benefits. And it's absolutely with the situation where there's more learning challenges associated. So, Jim?
Yeah. I think the literature talks an awful lot about what Nidhi just said. So explicit instruction, breaking concepts down into pieces, lots of practice, lots of modeling, lots of guided learning integrated into it. Worked examples, setting up the classroom so there are a few distractions. I think that's what the literature suggests, as far as I know.
Yeah.
But I'm not a particular expert in that field, but that's my understanding. What's your understanding?
Well, it really depends on the student, and I'm big on creating what I call schema cards, which are basically like the steps that try and reduce the load for a student actually trying to do the work, right? So and thinking of a particular student that every day in class they wrote a journal entry, and we had the steps written out of exactly he was supposed to do, because he was so concerned with what he had to do instead of actually doing it. And that allowed his EA or SEA, whatever you call them, to say, look, we have the steps, let's work on the process. And doing anything that you could do to reduce the load definitely provided success. And just thinking about the kids with processing speed issues, I see a real reluctance for teachers to give families information about what they're going to do next, because they're fearful of not meeting that what they've outlined for the students. But it really inhibits the ability to front load at home,
right,
and get reading done over the summer, right? So they're familiar with the book, they have the information, and we need to get rid of the fear of the educator of not covering everything they expect. But it's really hard when individuals who are not in the education field don't understand the challenges that occur within a classroom, and how you can't say, okay, this is my course outline for elementary school students or even high school students, because as you get to know them, you have a better understanding of capabilities and best ways to support them.
right. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great description, and appreciate you sharing that. That makes a lot of sense to me too. And especially your point about, about engaging the parents at home and having them participate in the process as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, MJ, for hosting it for us. And thanks everyone who stuck around. Really appreciate. And you know how to get in touch with us. We'll be sharing all the resources, including the recording and some other things that we mentioned today.